I'm the management fellow in the Board of Selectmen's office. It's kind of the point of contact to get these gentlemen together. I'm glad that they could donate their time to talk about cannabis cultivation and hopefully inform you guys of this and answer any questions you have. So the first look at the agenda, I'll give them a brief introduction and we'll kind of let them get to it. I prefer that all questions are at the end. That way we can have a Q&A session and they can address some topics before then. So we'll get started. This is James McMahon. He's the chairman of the Mass Cannabis Association.
Cannabis Business Association.
Cannabis Business Association. Excuse me.
No worries, no worries. Long title.
This is Bill St. Croix.
Yep.
He's an agronomy enthusiast from Ware, Massachusetts. And the very end is Eric Schwartz. He is the co-founder of FarmBug with Adam Goodless. So we'll start off with some frequently asked questions. First one that comes to mind is, why is marijuana considered agriculture? And what's the difference between outdoor cultivation and indoor cultivation? So if you guys want to discuss that.
I think, if you guys want to talk maybe a little bit about Part 4, excluded from 61A. Okay.
Yeah, right. So I'll jump in. So at the state level, as James was mentioning, marijuana is not considered agriculture, which, James, is that 351A it is?
I know it's Part 4. I believe it's 351A.
Yeah, so in other words, 351A is essentially the right to farm law at the state level. And during the process of passing question 4, shortly after it was passed, there was a closed door session in the, up at the State House, in which 351A was basically right to farm except for marijuana. So what that essentially means is, in order for cannabis to be cultivated on farmland, you don't have a right to farm it under agriculture. You have to be zoned for cultivation. So that's kind of the general thought.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. There's in the operative laws, there's a statutory prohibition against counting marijuana cultivation as either agriculture or horticulture for zoning purposes. So that is something that is somewhat incongruous with, as Bill might tell you, you take a plant, put it in the soil, germinate the plant, harvest the crop, and bring it to market. That's very close to agriculture in my book, but there is some form of, as with many different parts of the marijuana industry, there's catch-up that needs to be done between what is actually happening and what the regulations state. We can see that in banking, we can see that in some zoning issues, and I think it's meetings like this tonight that sort of help move that process along, help normalize the introduction of cannabis businesses into the community, and go far in destigmatizing them. And removing that stigma is really the biggest thing that will have cannabis be considered a business like any other, agriculture like any other, which is, I think, the goal of everyone on this side of the table tonight. I don't want to speak for you, but.
Yeah, I think as far as the way it's defined, like we've mentioned, it right after the election in 2016, there was a closed door session in Massachusetts State House late night that declared cannabis is not considered agriculture, and there's a lot of reasons why, probably that for that, or but more or less that just means that it's all up to individual towns to zone properly and to make sure that this industry is open to individuals or into entities that want to enter the market. So you really have to be careful what your as early on as possible, what the bylaws are, where the zoning is, in order to be able to open an establishment. Because right now, the way it's written throughout the state is mostly it's in industrial and commercial zones. That makes it a lot harder for people that practice agriculture who have been exempted more or less or written out of the medical. And this is an opportunity, I think, for people to kind of be heard and to be able to participate without being secluded or segregated to one particular part of town, which is usually in industrial commercial areas are just narrow strips. Sometimes the soil may be questionable. There could be EPA issues standing And honestly, if we want to make high quality cannabis, we want a nice, clean, clear, open field that gets a nice breeze going. So I think those things are important to make sure our towns can allow this.
I'd like to speak a little bit to what Bill said. I think if we look back at Massachusetts, there is a fantastic agricultural heritage here in Massachusetts. When the Pilgrims first came off the Mayflower, the story we all heard is they met with Native Americans who taught them how to plant the crops that would suit the soil and taught them how to survive by use of agriculture here in Massachusetts. That agriculture, as we can all see, the apple orchards, especially in this area, that have been fantastic, dairy farms as you get a little further west, there is a very, very strong agricultural backbone to Massachusetts. And I'd be very excited to see cannabis and hemp farming as a continuance of that agricultural heritage and supporting farmers like Bill who are out there every day in the soil, working twice as hard to farm organically and to do it in a conscientious and in a sustainable fashion. I think we should be doing everything we can to support responsible people like Bill and their goals to do that. At the end, I think at the end.
Yeah, questions at the end.
Can I have a question?
So what's to prevent me from growing plants inside my home? Like, what's the difference between indoor cultivation and outdoor? Are there difference in regulations for that?
Well, so that's sort of almost two questions. So the home grows are protected by statute. You are allowed 6 plants for each adult in the home to a maximum of 12 plants, and that's personal home cultivation. That can be done either indoor or outdoor so long as some security provisions are followed. But then there's the larger question of the traditional style of cultivation is what we've had up till now, which has all been indoor cultivation, and the new style, which people like Bill and Eric are hoping to get more involved with, which is outdoor cultivation in the actual fields themselves. So the first part of the question, you're allowed 6 to 12 plants at home, depending on your household structure. Any more than that, and you are outside the bounds of the law, so law enforcement will, do what they can to step in there. If you are fully permitted and licensed, then you'd be where these guys are standing. I'd let them speak as experts on that subject.
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick because I actually am a home grower. So I have 2 tents in my home, a 2x4 veg tent, 2x4 flowering tent. I actually just pulled the flowers and hanging them up to dry now. Should be about a week or so to dry, and then they'll, I'll trim them up and they'll start the curing process. So as far as the home growing, James is absolutely right. It's 6 plants per person and 12 plants per household. I actually only have 4, only 2 now after I pulled my other ones. Because generally I don't have enough space. I have enough space, maybe 6 total, that kind of thing. And I don't know, for me, it's been a very rewarding process. You can, as a home grower, you can also keep anything you produce. It's completely legal to keep all of your production as a home grower in the house. So that's just, maybe an interesting note that folks don't know. But yeah, on the commercial side, an interesting thing came up with the CCC as to the way that they define outdoor. We have an interesting climate here in Massachusetts. It's obviously a little more, intense as far as our winters, is comparison to like California, for instance, obviously. And so I had a question to the commission as to how they were going to define, outdoor, because theoretically you could define, a greenhouse as being outdoor. Versus just a full outdoor field, for instance, And the way that they defined it is outdoor is anything that, I want to make sure I get this right. Outdoor is anything that you're not using supplemental lights on mature plants, if that makes any sense. So in other words, if you have a greenhouse, as long as you're not using supplemental lights on mature plants, let's say you're using them to veg, that's fine, and that's considered outdoor. If you are using some during the maturing process, then technically you're considered indoor. The only reason why that matters at all is the licensing process, and it's actually half the cost per square foot for a true outdoor versus an indoor scenario, which is, again, it's twice the cost, basically, per square foot. So if you are in a greenhouse, if you're using supplemental light on a mature plant, technically you're going to be paying more per square foot. So it's only at the licensing level that it really matters. I think it's important for us to understand that cannabis can be cultivated any sort of means necessary, if you will, as long as you're under the state regulation. So what I'm saying is it can be fully indoor, it can be partially greenhouse, it can be fully a field. There's obviously heavy regulations as far as how that setup needs to be, but it's just important to understand that outdoor is completely fine under the current regulations.
And to just jump in quickly on what Eric was saying there, in the cost per square foot, that's not related to build out or operational cost, that's a licensing fee. So the Cannabis Commission has allowed what they call Canopy Size, which is essentially the productive square footage of your facility, anywhere from 1,000 square feet to 100,000 square feet with gradations inside of there. You pay an annual license fee based on the amount of square feet you have under cultivation. Those fees are cut in half if it's outdoor. So that's that cost per square foot fee. It's based on the actual amount of area under productive cultivation.
I think I'd like to say one of the main things between homegrown and or residential cultivation for personal use and commercial is that the testing that has to go on before it's packaged has to be tested for molds, mildews, pesticides, pretty much just to make sure it's safe medicine. That's one of the main things, just really, and also with the residential, you can only gift your cannabis, you can't trade, you can't use it as incentive towards any kind of gift or anything. It can't be in trade for anything. You're allowed to do certain things, but also will be allowed to do extractions. As far as the actual quality at the end, some people do a lot of really good cannabis is grown by smaller growers because they're able to give that attention. It's out in Bay Area, California, a lot of the dispensaries out there, some of the finest stuff comes out of a 4-light operation where people were able to pay that kind of attention. A lot of the cultivators that are trying to do this, especially in the craft co-op, where a lot of us are striving for live soil and to also use sustainability in mind, with also no chemicals, no harsh chemicals, try to use as many fermented plant extracts, oils, natural plant oils, and whatever we can use, even specified strains of bacteria and fungus can help. It's like BT, which they use in corn production, all these other types of productions. That's really effective, and it's also washes off pretty easy.
That's one of the great things that farmers like Bill, who have been organic farmers for so long, are really familiar with. Under the regulations, you're not allowed to use anything that is not essentially a naturally derived plant protein or plant substance. Really the harshest insecticide you'll see is something called neem oil, NEEM. It's brought from the resin of pine trees, and it's a sort of disinfectant. And it's really looking at things like that. The majority of pest control, at least in the indoor facilities, is usually done through predatory beneficial insects. So releasing praying mantises and ladybugs into the facility to go after aphids instead of trying to insecticide and spray around. So not only is it a very, very low input product in terms of what the farmers are looking to put into it philosophically, but also what the Cannabis Commission has allowed to come into plants. And it's farmers with the experience like Bill who really can jump right into that system because they're already operating in that fashion.
Yeah, I think one thing to take note on that is a lot of these chemicals or pesticides or any type of the topical application hasn't been tested for smoking. A lot of those are tested for the skins of fruit, which have a hard cuticle or a rind a lot of times. So you can't. There's a whole chain of studies that have to be performed. So in our eyes, or my eyes, and farmers like that choose to go down that path, it seems a lot easier and just to avoid all of it altogether. Just prevention as opposed to treatment.
Yeah, just a real quick piggyback off of what Bill said, kind of to emphasize what he was getting at there is cannabis being a flower can actually take on pesticides more readily because it has more surface area than say an apple that has more of a harder core or that sort of thing. So from just a medicinal standpoint, that's obviously something to keep in mind as far as ensuring that our cannabis, where does it come from, how is it grown? I think as both as patients and consumers, that's certainly something that for one, the organization that I'm building, Farm Bug Cooperative, that's definitely an area I think we want to jump into as far as education, really educating both the patient and consumer about the cultivation side and how cannabis is cultivated to ensure that, we have the sort of the cleanest, most organic, medicine or however you want to look at it at the end of the day as the end user.
Could you guys go into as far as farmers that might receive federal funds? Would this affect them at all, growing cannabis?
Well, so that's a bit of a gray area, as is all federal interaction, because, as we know, to be frank, this is still a Schedule I product on the federal side of scale. Now, there's been some great work that Massachusetts has done, especially in the Cannabis Commission, putting in safe harbor provisions into the regulation, saying that, as long as you're in compliance with the state program, that won't be held against you in those decisions. But quite frankly, there are some things that are out of the state's hands with involvement of FDA and USDA. So, you might know a bit more intimately than I do, but the best answer I can give is it is a gray area.
Yeah, I think with what we've kind of done a little bit of look into it, and I've also spoken with the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, and they're not really handling the cannabis thing at all, but they were saying pretty much the only real thing is you have to take your property out of 61A for anything that's being used for the cannabis cultivation. You're also not allowed to use, if you have farm plates, you can't use farm plates on that parcel, just for the reason that it's not under the exemption of the farm. So those are probably the two main hurdles or issues that people are going to deal with. Other than that, it seems pretty cut and dry. I think there's legislation being proposed by Elizabeth Warren and Corey Gardner, that's right, from Colorado, and that's going to help a lot more in the banking issues where they're pushing to have state banks. I'm sure James knows a lot more about that, but as far as the farmer, they're kind of it's kind of protecting them a little bit, and the feds are kind of at this point talking about backing off and not legalizing, but just leaving it to states' decisions. So those two issues, and I think maybe some wishful thinking for the future.
Yeah, I think Bill brings up a good point, and this is a debate that came up in Hardwick. I attended a planning board meeting there. It's, technically you can have an entire field, let's say, that's agriculture, and in the center of that field, there's a cannabis farm, and that's not considered agriculture. So, these are the dilemmas, I think, that we are encountering of it not being considered agriculture. So, like Bill was saying, technically, you could have ag plates on your truck or whatever. You drive that truck into the area where cannabis is being grown, and that's sort of technically no longer an agricultural place.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd have to be performing work. I'm sure if maybe you were just using it, just driving there or not, but or if you were using it maybe to deliver materials from a farm and buying, if you were buying stuff from a farm and that farm's farm truck, but I think you wouldn't be able to operate anything that you're getting tax subsidies through the government for on that particular site, and that's the 61A.
So in my mind, it's just, the levels of complication that gives because it's not agriculture.
And I think that, and I know that the Ann Goby is my representative, and I know that she's actually working on repealing the 351A exemption to help make, because cannabis, it's a plant. It was agriculture all the way up until 80 years ago, and then they deemed it not agriculture. So I think this will prove important to our economy and our infrastructure soon. I'm sure enough to.
Yeah, and I would just say, real quick, sort of from an advocacy standpoint, because I'm, an advocate for the plant, if you will, and for the farmer, that, local farm bureaus, there definitely has been talk of local farm bureaus, hopefully going to the state level to, like Bill said, eliminate it from three, or are we taking that section out?
Yes, eliminate the
351A. So, theoretically, that's something that folks could get involved with either through your local farm bureau or at the state level through MDAR. It would be technically because the 351A sits with MDAR. MDAR is the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. So.
Yeah, and I can say, just piggybacking off what Eric said, in my experience, I've been working with communities all across the Commonwealth Ag commissions, farming commissions, conservation commissions have really taken a leadership role on this in a lot of communities and have really stepped up to say, what can we do to support farmers within our community? A concept that I've been bringing up and something that I've discussed with Bill is everyone's very familiar with CSAs in the terms of community-supported agriculture and people from the community purchasing shares in the future products of a farm to be able to enable that farmer to have working capital that he needs to go forward and continue his operations. I think the next wave of that CSA is cannabis-supported agriculture, where a farmer can have a 1 acre plot of cannabis, use that to pay his bills, and devote the rest of his farm to farming whatever they choose, heirloom varieties, crops that might not have as much cash value at market, and not say, how much corn and tomatoes can I pump out and get to the farmer's market? Let me grow something really novel and interesting that I'm passionate about. And I have the ability to do that because my, daily overhead has been covered by my cannabis operation within the farm. In my experiences, I really have not met a single farmer across the Commonwealth who says, I want to plow under all of my fields and turn this into a cannabis plantation. What they're all really saying is, I have an acre out back and I'd like to grow it on that acre out back. And really looking at it as a way to integrate it into the larger whole of their farm rather than making it their new specialty. Now, not to say that there aren't people doing that, but that's really my experience that I've seen.
I just think that's a great point. I think, me personally, my feeling is that cannabis is an opportunity to revitalize agriculture in Massachusetts. Just
Can I
my
make a point
personal
of
opinion.
order, please? I think a lot of people here don't understand the difference between cannabis. The fact of the matter is that industrial cannabis is 3%. And the cannabis that you're speaking to, growing to get you high on Delta 9 is, much greater than that.
I think you're
In
referring
fact,
to hemp. I think you're referring to hemp.
That's
Right.
correct. And
Okay.
hemp is cannabis.
I understand.
And
Right.
industrial cannabis that's what you'd be using
that's-
it for.
but
And
that's-
so when the Farm Bill came out, let me just finish. So when the Farm Bill came out, when Lewis did that, down there in Boston, I actually filed a 1062 bill that actually reversed the whole entire thing. And I'm just surprised, I'm sitting here, you don't even, have you ever gone into the records and seen it? Because it's got no support, and it actually supports the vote on 351, okay, and so forth. And that's where the Farm Bill was.
Steve, yeah, let's give them a chance to answer
So
that.
my
and then
point is that a lot of people here,
Steve.
anyway, let me finish. A lot of people here don't
we didn't
understand.
recognize you.
They don't understand the difference between the hemps that you're talking about. You can't picture that as just one,
Thank
you
you.
understand? What did you do that for?
Because we didn't recognize you. You're speaking out of order.
Oh, well, I had to do it.
Well, I think to address the hemp issue, that's actually completely in the hands of MDR, and they just started granting permits, special permits through MDR, which is that is a lot different, a lot easier, and a completely different commission set of laws than actual consumption cannabis. The one there's. Industrial hemp, it's pretty lax actually. You don't need the security, you don't need the fence. You can actually grow that similar to wheat or corn.
And the reason for that is hemp is legally defined as being less than 0.3% THC. So essentially a non-psychoactive product, completely non-psychoactive product. In any form, cannabis on the vine, quote unquote, is essentially non-smokable and non-consumable. It needs to be dried and cured before it can be consumed. Hemp, even after the drying and curing process, has limited to no psychoactive value with that less than 0.3% THC, as compared to a standard THC content in a cannabis sativa or cannabis indica, anywhere from 0 to 20-odd%, just to give sort of the range of scope that we're talking about here. Hemp farming is traditionally looked at for two main productive values out of it. Number one is the oil that you can extract from the hemp seeds, cannabidiol oil, CBD oil, which is something we've all been hearing more and more about in the news. It's a non-psychoactive chemical within the cannabis plant. It reduces inflammation, it increases blood flow, and it's usually used as some form of either a topical ointment or something along those lines. The other major thing that you get out of hemp is the fiber. It's an extraordinarily fibrous plant, and the fibrous stalk, which can be used for a variety of uses. People make paper out of it. People make clothing out of it and things of that nature, animal fodder, a very, very high-grade compost. And if we look back again, sort of hearkening back to that heritage of the Pilgrims that I was talking about, all of the sails on the Mayflower and all of the lines on the Mayflower were all made out of hemp because it's naturally rot resistant and naturally waterproof. So all throughout the age of sail, all of the sailing ships you see, the clipper ships, all had hemp sails and hemp lines due to those natural properties. So that's something that people are really interested in as well, using a sustainable, naturally rot resistant, naturally waterproof material, where in other cases you'd have to use a petroleum derived material such as a nylon or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a simplistic way of describing it, but it's same plant grown in a different way, basically.
Yeah, I think in the past year, so New York State has opened up hemp cultivation this year to a lot of farmers. They've also put into motion some infrastructure that will actually help farmers bring some of the hemp, because the biggest problem over the past 80 or more years is there's no machinery to process any of the hemp, so it's almost useless. And so we need to make new mills. We got to prepare to make textiles again. So these machinery is really, really expensive. So there's a couple places that have helped this along, New York State being one. I know up in Vermont, the Northeast Grain Growers Association did hemp trials last year, and so now they've worked out a couple different varieties that'll work for people. Maine's going forward pretty much on the hemp, but I think theirs is more, their focus is a little bit more towards the non-psychoactive oils. But bottom line is, it's coming, and it's just going to be tough until we can have some mills. You can take it down with the combine if you're doing in the fields for different purposes, but once you get it, what are you going to do with it? Really, that's pretty much what it turns into. So that's an infrastructural issue that we're going to have to deal with a little bit at a time. But that's until there's the incentive to build these. Some of this machinery is like hundreds of millions of dollars to develop for a plant to do to even harvest the hemp, the hemp fibers. So that's definitely going to happen, and I'm sure incentive will be there this year once people start applying through MDAR to grow hemp.
And it's something that we've been doing in the States for hundreds of years. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. Not to put myself in that same category, I recently found out my ancestors back in Ireland were hemp farmers before coming over to the States. I was in the cannabis industry for 3 years before finding that out. So, keeping up the family heritage. But, it's a fascinating product. Something else that's really cool about hemp is it's an incredibly environmentally productive product. One of the great things it can be used for is erosion control. Since it is non-psychoactive, for every inch a hemp plant grows above ground, it grows an inch below ground as well. It's essentially a mirror of what's above it in its root structure. So to use it as a way to anchor soils and naturally anchor soils without having to put in those perforated retaining walls that you see 3 years after the project half fallen down, and be able to say, no, it's just a wall of hemp holding up that riverbank. The other thing that's really cool about hemp is it is essentially a vacuum that leaches heavy metals up out of the soil. And while that's a huge issue for people who are farming marijuana, that's actually a great benefit of hemp. And I'm working with a farmer out in western Massachusetts who's interested in using hemp for brownfield remediation and going into former sites that have heavy metal content. And instead of having to scrape the topsoil, cart it off to a secure landfill, and put new topsoil back down, what he wants to do is plant hemp, pull the heavy metals up out of the soil with the hemp, harvest that, and just dispose of the hemp in a secure landfill. And that way you're not carting dump truck loads of soil, you have one of the plants. The last thing about hemp, as I'm going through these little fun facts, I just think this is the coolest thing. An acre of hemp produces the same amount of oxygen as 6 acres of pine trees. So it is incredibly efficient and productive in what it does. So using it as a carbon store, using it as a sort of heavy metal vacuum, and using it for erosion control are some pretty out-of-the-box ideas of what can be done with hemp, and I think it's very exciting to look at some of the possibilities there.
Would you guys be willing to discuss host community agreements and what those entail?
Sure. So the host community agreement is a necessary part of the application and licensure process, and essentially it is an agreement between just picking heads at the table, a prospective operator and the town administration. And essentially what it is conditions that are put upon the business to make sure that in practice there are essentially zero net losses to the community from hosting a cannabis facility, sort of a mitigation of community impacts. So the way that is put out into a host community agreement is municipalities are allowed to ask for up to a 3% revenue share of the gross sales of a facility, And that 3% revenue share is put into a special fund, which is used for dollar offsets of the impact on the facility. So one that traditionally is used is, this facility is now at, in a part of town where we traditionally didn't have the police patrol. Now they stop by once or twice a week. So to, fit that in, we have a patrolman working a little bit extra. So we're going to cover the overtime for that budget out of the cannabis funds. Things that, it typically wouldn't include are, we want to put new streetlights up on Main Street because, it's just a little too dark or something like that. It needs to be directly related to the offsets of the cannabis business. So the Cannabis Commission has some pretty strong conditions on what can and can't be in a host community agreement. We're starting to see a lot of news reports of some communities maybe creatively interpreting that. So, and that's about as much as I'm willing to say. So, what I think is important to do is for there really to be a strong and open and transparent relationship between an operator and the municipality, where you can come in and say, here's all my cards on the table. Here's what I'm looking at. What do you guys have on your side? How can we meet in the middle here? How can I work with you? And with a relationship like that, I think you can obviate a lot of the need for cost-based mitigation by saying, how can we adjust our plans and let you do your future planning in a way that is proactive instead of reactive? Other things that can be addressed through a host community agreement are some forms of quality of life, I guess is sort of the catch-all term for it. Perhaps a restriction on operating hours, things of that nature. Things that I like to put into host community agreements, again, are more progressive. So when I'm working with clients and I'm helping them write host community agreements, some provisions that I really like to work in there are advertise local, hire local for jobs. That, all jobs, and this is obviously within the bounds of state and federal employment law, but as much as allowed to, jobs are advertised first within the local community, and really try to have the business reflect that local community. Another thing I really like to put in there are bid local for the work, so that, these jobs are being bid out to local contractors for the build out phases and everything else like that, really support an infrastructure within the town and within the trades in the town. A third thing that I always like to try to work into I should say I have four, but the third thing I really like to work into my host community agreements are what I like to call either a community cannabis board or a marijuana advisory committee. And essentially that would be an ad hoc committee, usually made up of town administrators, chiefs of police, chiefs of the fire department, representatives from the Board of Selectmen, a representative from the Board of Health, really the stakeholders in town that would be concerned with such an issue, and also have invited members from the cannabis industry in town and citizen members who are not involved with the cannabis industry, because I think it's really important for them to have a voice as well in this whole process. Usually, the way that I've worked with these boards, they meet typically once a month, maybe every other month, depending on how many projects are going on within the community, and it's really just a way to have an ongoing chain of communication and an ongoing discussion within the community as to what's happening there, and that can be worked into the host community agreement, either participation in such a board or establishing such a board. The fourth thing that I really like to put into my host community agreements is typically a community service day. I like to say that, at least once per quarter, the employees of the cannabis facility will devote a paid day on the cannabis end to working on town projects that can be selected either by the town administrator or be selected by a vote of the town officials if there's a parks committee or a conservation committee, something of that nature, just as a way to really reinforce those community ties and really do extra to give back to the community. So some people look at these host community agreements as a regressive measure, but I look at them as an opportunity to really create positive change and to put that into a formalistic fashion and say, we are very willing to go above and beyond on our end of things, and here's proof positive that we'll do so.
Yeah, I need you to do that committee in Somerville, because I'm trying to do this. I live in Somerville. I'm trying to convince them to do the same thing as far as the group that kind of decides what business we want in town, what who should we grant licenses to.
Let me jump in. So I should say, typically the boards that I set up are not in that capacity.
Oh, okay.
They're much more of a informal discussion. So not a rulemaking board, not an adjudicative board, not an evaluative board. They're not giving any input on prospective applicants. That stays within the province of either planning committee, ZBA, or the town administrator. It would be much more exactly what we're doing tonight, typically. Let's have a panel discussion. Let's discuss some topics that are out there. We're not going to make any decisions. We're not going to make any policy, but let's have a forum for this informed discussion.
So I'm just curious, because now you sparked my interest. So is the idea then the committee, though, would kind of report into like a planning board, for instance, on like their findings or that sort of thing?
So the most that I've done in something like that is essentially a planning board has said, here are some topics that we'd like researched.
Right,
Can
right.
you deliver us a report?
Yeah.
And the reports that, at least as I feel most comfortable, the report should always come back neutral. It should come back with a pro option,
Right.
an anti option, and a no action option, and say these are if you do it, if you don't do it, or if you do nothing, these are what we think will happen in each of those 3 scenarios. Now you, as the planning board, decide what you're going to do.
So, all right. So James sort of alluded to the creative ways that municipalities are in the past. You're sort of doing some of these host agreements. I won't get into anything in depth, but I thought that it's a little important, maybe at this stage, related to the host agreements, to getting the idea of the medical law and the vote and how that sort of played out, the structure of that, and how adult use played out. The medical law was formed in such a way that dispensaries were vertically integrated and had to, essentially prove that they had millions in the bank. The application process was also very, very expensive to even apply to become a medical dispensary. All of those were greatly reduced with the adult use law that was passed. And the regulations are very friendly to small business. The licensing fee have come down to practically nothing. I mean, I think it's maybe $300 or so, depending on.
Yeah, between $300 and $500, and then a $5,000 annual renewal fee, versus up to about $250,000 in application costs and a $50,000 annual license fee.
Right. So, I'm just acknowledging that because there's been, I think a bit of a shift that maybe is being recognized, maybe needs to be recognized more before, from sort of this medical law and established industry into the adult use industry. And as, a smaller local operator, as far as the host agreements, I would agree with James in the sense that, that's what we're trying to do when we go into communities, to really talk about, how we can be good for the community as a cooperative, offer volunteer hours. I think those are all very good ideas, and we're folks, also from Massachusetts. I think one of the things that we're very big on is the money sort of staying local, right? That's, sort of an idea that I think we're all kind of familiar with over the last, couple decades. So it's not only kind of that small farming mentality in terms of, the way that cannabis is cultivated. I think it also hopefully has an impact on the environment, and also an impact on the local community in terms of, wanting to be very much a part of that community and a citizen of the world, if you will. As a cooperative too, we also, by regulations, have to adhere to the 7 principles of a cooperative, and one of those principles is community involvement. So I also try to kind of convey that to municipalities when I'm working in municipalities to, give the impression that, we want to be here and hopefully we'll be a good part of the community and a long-standing part that can give back to the community at the end of the day. So
I think, just to piggyback off what Eric was saying, that's really the best way I see I feel main purpose in working in cannabis is to help destigmatize this and have it be treated as a business and as a product like any other. It's a legal product, it's a legal business here in the Commonwealth, and I think the more we can do to reduce fear, uncertainty, and doubt and promote it as a productive business, we should be doing everything we can to that. So integrating into the community, really, saying, let's not look at this as how can we take these businesses and stick them in the worst plots of land on the absolute outskirts of town so they never have any vehicle traffic and, they're in a building where businesses have failed every 6 months for the past 20 years, but maybe this one will catch on, something like that. I think, zone appropriately, zone in a responsible fashion, but, look to these really as other businesses in your community and other productive businesses within your community. So having that degree of community involvement and saying this isn't something we need to hide, this isn't something we need to be ashamed of, this isn't something we need to pretend doesn't exist. Well, we don't need to, be jumping up and down in the streets. We can say, yeah, just like the liquor store, just like the car wash, and just like the grocery, we also have a cannabis business, and all 4 of them sponsored the 5K road race, things of that nature to really make it well supported within the community.
Bill, did you want to jump in or add anything?
Well, I guess they covered a lot of it as far as just outreach and community participation. Because I will say, as opposed to the liquor stores or any of the other stores in town, I mean, the cannabis industry will be contributing considerably more funds to the town, and I think with the stigma that's attached to it, the community host agreement, I think, is a good way to reach out and say, hey, we are the face of the farmers. We're not, as Eric said, we're local. We hire local. We get our compost down from the local place down the street, or we source our materials and stuff from our local co-ops and whatever. And also, we live in the town, so we're not sending our money back to wherever the CEO or the head of the chain, the corporation lives, so where the stockholders live. We're actually, we're the farmers. We live in the town. We're contributing here. We're hiring here, and we're transparent. We're not this building with the blank face, and you call and you get a secretary, and you call and you get one of us, and we talk, and we want to be able to outreach and have people come and interact with us. Any positive or negative feedback.
Could you guys talk about the different sectors or different industries that revolve around cannabis cultivation? I assume there's more to it than just the farming aspect.
So there's two parts to that question. The first is the Cannabis Commission has outlined for a lot of new license types that didn't exist under the medical program. So as Eric said, the medical program, you were required to be vertically integrated. So you cultivated the product, you processed and packaged it yourself, and you retailed it out of your own stores, and everything stayed within that silo. Now, you can do any one of those three in addition to a variety of other types. You can do all 7 if you'd like, and God bless you if you have the time and energy for it, or you can focus more intensely on one of those license types. So 3 that are, we've discussed a little bit here that we're pretty familiar with. Of course, the craft cooperative, which Eric can speak in incredible detail about. There's the cultivation, and there's no difference between an indoor and outdoor cultivation license. The difference comes in the fee structure and the regulations regarding security and siting. So you have, craft cooperatives, you have cultivator, you have what's called the manufacturer, which is essentially a processor who would take the raw material and do some form of value add to it, whether that's processing it into an oil, whether that's taking that oil and processing it into an edible, or taking the oils and filling vaporizer cartridges. You're doing some form of value add to the product, and that's the manufacturer. The type that has been in the news the most is the retailer, which I think we are all very familiar with that concept. We can get a little bit more into discussing the particulars of it, but the retailer is a license type, and that's sort of the traditional vertically integrated ones. Some of the new ones that have come out that I'm really excited about, the first one is the research lab. And as Bill was saying earlier, there really has not been a lot of objective science and evidence-based research done for long-term studies on cannabis within the United States. And I know that's a lot of couching of it, but really the biggest issue there is there's no availability for federal funding for research products because it still is a Schedule I drug. So that research is being done on the state level, and it's being done at the private level. And the research is being done to an incredibly high standard. These are very passionate and dedicated scientists. And I think it's fantastic that Massachusetts is giving them an opportunity to study the plant and work on it. So it's an independent testing lab. They need to be completely independent from any other cannabis business. And they really are sort of viewed as an objective, standard setting and research institution. And I think that's something that's really exciting and will really help propel and progress the industry. Another one that's come out that I'm a huge, huge fan of is the microbusiness. The microbusiness is exactly what it sounds like. A microbusiness is by definition a very small cannabis business. A majority of the ownership structure needs to have been Massachusetts residents for the past 5 years. So it's really designed to be local operators operating in a smaller facility, giving people an easier entry into the market with lower upfront costs. You're limited in your square footage of production. I believe you're limited to 5,000 square feet of canopy, so that'd be a tier 1 operator. You're also limited to purchasing 2,000 pounds of cannabis flower to be processed in your facility if you're a micro licensed processor. 2,000 pounds sounds like a lot, but you're really looking at, getting out 10 to 20% if you're really lucky of oil weight versus that dry weight. when you're reducing it down. Just like anything, when you're taking an oil out of it, you're getting orders and orders of magnitude less. So I love the micro license. It's my favorite license type. The people that I work with in the micro license sector are almost exclusively family businesses, brothers, fathers and sons, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. And it really is a way for people to gain entry into the marketplace without having some of those huge barriers that Eric was talking about earlier in terms of cost of capital, finding locations, things of that nature. Even the staffing and build-out costs. The micro license keeps all of that a lot closer to the vest. Another one that I really like is the transporter's license. The transporter's license, I think, is fantastic because it's solely someone operating a logistics service. They don't produce the flower, they don't sell the flower, they just take it from point A to point B in a secure fashion. And I think if we can have people who specialize in that, devote their time and attention to it, devote the logistics to it, that really takes away a huge cost center for smaller operators who now don't have to buy and fit out a van and have two people in the van at all times and GPS tracked and video tracked, and a couple $100,000 later you're ready to hit the road. Or you could sign a contract with a third-party operator and pay by the mile. It makes it a lot easier to get into that line of business. Did I miss one? I think there's 7. So we did. You got 7? All right. But then to your other question, as I'm sorry, I let you guys, I know craft cooperatives. There also are a lot of businesses that I like to call sort of an ancillary cannabis business that are service providers to the cannabis business. Security companies, construction firms are all over this. Civil engineers love the cannabis industry. But there's also the people who produce the actual packaging, the people who build and repair and outfit the machines that are used for extraction. So it really becomes not just the actual licensees working within the industry, it's a whole host of people who are working to support it and working within it. A statistic that's very typically used in government estimation is with every one direct job created. So with every one direct job created by a cannabis licensee, there are 5 jobs created within the community to support that. And that's everything from the person who's dropping off and picking up the uniforms to the person who opened up a deli down the block to serve lunch to everyone coming into this new facility. So it really, a phrase that I use to the risk of overusing is a rising tide lifts all ships. And as these cannabis businesses succeed, they bring a lot of businesses up along and with them.
Yeah, I did. Just sort of piggyback off of that. I'm very much looking forward to partnering with a lot of these ancillary businesses. I'm in marketing now, and a lot of success in the current economy, at least from my experience, is partnering with the right vendors, basically. A lot of it is honestly through technology vendors, at least in my space that I'm in currently. And it's really sort of developing relationships with those partners or vendors or however you want to look at them so that they're almost a part of your business. So I see a lot of opportunity in ancillary businesses that grow around the cannabis industry. I guess to go in a little more depth, I did have a lot of advocacy work that I did for the Craft Marijuana Cultivator Cooperative license. Essentially, I'll kind of throw it out there as to how I advocated for it in front of the Cannabis Control Commission. I really came at it from a point of sort of a classic cultivator cooperative. So if you think about let's say dairy, for instance, the Gaelic farms at your local, grocery store. That milk comes from a number of different farms. And so the idea behind the Craft Marijuana Cultivator Cooperative, I found out later that it actually originated, I believe, in the law from Senator Sears' office. He's in the Cape. And I guess it was based off of shellfish cooperatives that they have in Cape Cod. So the idea basically was that multiple cultivators could come together and work under one license. So that's essentially the Craft Marijuana Cultivator Cooperative license. You can also have up to 3 manufacturing facilities under that license. So the idea is that cultivators can essentially work together and as a group, you have a decent amount more of buying power, for instance, because you're buying in bulk for the cooperative. You can, form partnerships, as I mentioned, with other local businesses that would feed into the cooperative. And then there's also, I sort of alluded to this before, there's also the requirement within the state regulations that anyone applying for a craft marijuana cultivator cooperative has to has to exist under those 7 principles of a cooperative that were put forth by, I think it's like the International Cooperative Organization. I can look it up, it's online, but that's a requirement within the licensing as well. So I think that hopefully gives a general.
And, the cooperatives have been incredibly successful within Massachusetts. Ocean Spray is a cooperative. Cabot Dairy is a cooperative. Land O'Lakes is a cooperative. There's the Massachusetts Maple Cooperative. So these are structures that farmers are very, very familiar with. And just like Eric said, it allows you to coordinate and enhance your voice, your buying power, and your ability to bring products to market because you're working in that cooperative fashion. So, cooperatives are something that have succeeded and thrived within Massachusetts and other industries, and this is just adding another one to that portfolio.
I think as far as cannabis industry businesses that can be created, you look back this thing, they're calling this the green rush. If you look back to the gold rush, the people that made the most money were the people selling the picks and shovels. And those are the people that really stuck around because there were some people out there doing some hard work. I've seen everywhere from people being able to produce their own worm castings or compost to selling actual live worms to at some of the conventions, like the convention in Boston this year. There's everywhere from the local greenhouse suppliers to the local sticker and label companies. All these other people were able to come in and say, hey, there's room for us at the table. There's a little bit of something for us to come in and get something. So, this is really it's a time for people to be creative because I've seen also a lot of new products coming out. People, and a lot of these products aren't necessarily for the commercial industry. A lot of these are for the home grower. Different ways to make it easier. Different products that are in the agricultural and industrial commercial industries like refrigeration or in electrical or whatever. Some of the controls that really can be applied and creatively on a smaller scale and help people more automate or make their home grows more efficient and give them a little bit more variety, I think. So it's a good opportunity all around.
And something that we've been focusing on is really the people who either directly touch the plant or are servicing those who directly touch the plant. But there's also a lot of larger scale people who are involved in the cannabis sphere. Attorneys like myself, marketers like Eric, there's cannabis trade publications, cannabis blogs. There's the podcast now out there that's going on. So there's a lot of, even not related to how am I supporting the direct production of cannabis, there's a lot that is done in, sort of cannabis sphere. So I think, it's important to not just think, oh, am I selling the lights, but maybe I am, the person who's writing the newspaper articles about the light shop in town and things like that. So it really, again, that rising tide sort of lifts all ships.
Yeah, and there's really, I think, a culture, I think that's kind of what James is alluding to, that goes along with the industry and let's face it, there's at least in my book, there's a camaraderie that goes along with cannabis. It sort of goes hand in hand. I don't know if we want to go too in depth in this, but the elephant in the room there is social use. And just to kind of throw it out there, social use was delayed by the Cannabis Control Commission as far as any of those licenses. So that's not currently a license that's available, but the commission has said that they'll likely look at that, I think, in the fall. That's generally what we're looking at now. But
Yeah, I think they start in October and are hoping to have some recommendations by February. So social use is the phrase that's being used for consumption of cannabis on a licensed premises on private property. So it's not saying on the sidewalks, it's not saying on town parks or anything like that. It's saying if an individual in town wants to go through the licensing steps, deal with Massachusetts secondhand smoke laws and everything else to set up essentially a cannabis bar, they would have the ability to do so. That would be incredibly regulated, incredibly overseen, and that's really one of the biggest reasons for that delay and pushback is to make sure that there are effective regulations in place to do so. So again, as Eric said, hoping to really not get too far into that because no one knows what it's going to look like until October. There's a lot of rumors swirling around, but there's really no concrete information. Some of the things I can say for social use, I look at it as it's one of the best ways to reduce actual public consumption of marijuana. If you give a safe and legal space for people to consume the product, it gives them an alternative venue to consuming in public. The other thing I would say in that fashion is under federal housing laws, if you are in federally subsidized housing, you can be evicted for consumption of marijuana, even if it is state legal. So let's say, you're 85 years old and you're in Section 8 housing and you have glaucoma and you're a medical patient. You can't smoke it outside because that's not private property on your sidewalk, and you can't smoke it in your house because that's also not allowed under the federal laws. So where is a responsible patient supposed to use their medical products aside from a venue that allows consumption of cannabis? And that's really something that I think needs to be considered and needs to be thought about in the aspect of these social use lounges. They're not purely recreational facilities. They're not, festivals. I'm sure some will be, but they're not all like that. A lot of them are really saying we can go forward on curing some social ills and providing an alternative and safe venue for the consumption of cannabis. Another thing that I think is fantastic about social use lounges is if someone consumes maybe a little outside their limits or a little more than they were expecting, they're in a safe, contained facility with trained people who can help them respond to that situation. If they have a little bit of anxiety or, if maybe they lose a little bit of coordination, they have the ability to remain in a safe space and have people who are trained to get them over the hump.
Do you guys want to touch on anything else before we open up the floor for questions? Bill, did you want to touch on anything?
Well, I see this cultivation up there. I wasn't really sure if, I guess I could leave that to the questions or anything. Seems like
If you don't
Yeah.
mind. So I'd just like to say as sort of a wrap up, I think the most important thing with this entire industry is to maintain an open mind and to look at things objectively and look at them in an evidence-based fashion. This is an incredibly, incredibly regulated industry. A statistic that I've heard thrown out many times is the only product in the Commonwealth that has more restrictions on its transportation than cannabis is plutonium. Not any kind of radioactive material, just plutonium. So that sort of tells you the degree of oversight and the degree of regulation that's involved with this product. The regulations are incredibly extensive. The Cannabis Commission has been incredibly proactive about making sure those regulations are enforced. They are really gearing up to make this be, as Forbes magazine recently said, this is going to be the new standard in the United States. Everyone has been looking to Colorado, and Massachusetts has taken a lot from Colorado, looked at the best practices, and said, how can we make this fit the peculiarities and what makes Massachusetts so special? How can we morph these systems? We're the first state east of the Mississippi to do this, and I think we'll be looked to as a leader, and I'm proud of the industry that's being set up. I think it really puts us into that leadership position, but the only way that industry will succeed and thrive is through good relationships with municipal partners and good relationships with the communities.
Yeah, I guess, to piggyback off of what James said, again, just great points. There are 88 pages of state regulations, and as James said, there's a lot of regulations at the state level. So the reason why I'm saying that is because I do go to a lot of planning board meetings, and I know that cannabis is a new thing. It's also not a new thing, though. It has been part of an illicit market for years and years and years, right? It just hasn't been a regulated marketplace. And I do definitely empathize and understand the concerns that I hear when I sit on, town meetings and planning board meetings in terms of, how should we make this a part of our community so that our community is okay with it? What does occasionally occur, and this is a municipal meeting, is trying to add on more regulatory measures on top of the 88 pages of state measures. And unfortunately, just as a smaller business operator, it's at least my opinion, and I've said this to my municipality in Somerville, I've said this to a lot of different municipalities across central and western Massachusetts, is my belief that that actually hurts the smaller players in the industry. And the reason why is just, for me, it's kind of simple. It's time and money. The more that you sort of have to thread the needle to make sure that you're operating under the state regulations and also make sure that you're within whatever sort of bylaws that the local municipalities are trying to also have you adhere by, that essentially at the end of the day is more time, money, and capital Who does that favor? Generally, it favors people with, more capital in the bank, basically, at the end of the day. So, again, I would just say, it's not an easy process. We're all definitely working on this together. But yeah, I just would hope that municipalities do keep an open mind for the smaller operators, for the small, local businesses, folks trying to get in the industry. So, that's something that's definitely come up throughout my travels.
And let me just add one quick thing on. I'm sorry, but one quick thing. Another thing is there are 351 towns in Massachusetts. Each one of those 351 towns is addressing cannabis in a unique fashion. But I think what you need to think of is the towns can receive a 3% revenue share. They also can receive a 3% local sales tax. If the local municipal regulations are so overly burdensome that facilities choose to locate outside of that community, not only will they not realize those benefits, those dollars that could be staying within the community will be going to each of those bordering towns instead. So it's a balancing act on the municipal side. But I think the Cannabis Commission, with the regulations they have really empowered the municipalities and have really given the municipalities a fantastic, fantastic framework that they can safely and successfully operate these businesses with.
I think it's what I guess I'd wrap that with is just say this is a up and coming industry, and you can get into it and you can do it. It's forming a relationship. The first steps are checking your local municipalities and making sure that the zoning is proper and that they get your input on where you believe that cannabis should be allowed and should not be allowed to be cultivated or processed or sold or handled or whatever. Any of the opportunities that are coming out of this industry. If you're smaller and you're inexperienced, you can get involved with there's some co-ops out there that will, like Farm Bud Co-op, I know, which I work with, and they're willing to help people source materials, help with knowledge and standardized packaging and systems and everything else that you really need you can get that out there with the help of other people, whether it's with the co-op, whether it's with experienced individuals that know both sides of the law and what to do. So don't be intimidated and be active locally and proactive on how to make this available for yourself and other people in your community so everybody can benefit.
All right, so we'll open up the floor for questions. Yes.
Yes, as an agriculturalist, under cannabis cultivation, open cultivation, and this gets into logistics, and maybe it's not whatever it is, but what, under security measures, what are you looking, what are the logistics behind that? Are you looking at like a 20-foot fence, razor ribbon, electrified? In an open situation, which is not in a controlled environment, such as an old factory building, which has been converted through hydroponics or whatever, that nature. In other words, if we're looking at agriculture and we look at this community as we call it, agricultural community, what are you looking at? What would an agriculture be looking at that?
I'll do the short answer, you do the long answer.
Whatever.
Fence and cameras. But you could probably get a little deeper into that.
So we're not talking about like the Berlin Wall, like you were just mentioning, 20 feet and razor wire and patrols and everything else. No. So basically, just like Eric said, the two main things are access control, which is typically provided through fencing. And usually what that will be defined as is a fence around the plot that has cannabis being grown within it to separate it from the rest of the farm and to separate it from any interlopers. As we were saying earlier, cannabis on the vine really is a non-productive plant. It takes a few weeks of curing and processing and storing to have a real value. So there's not a risk of someone, just like someone wouldn't walk into a cornfield, take an ear of corn and chuck it into a pot. No, you wait for it to come to harvest and harvest it and go there. It's the same as, in the cannabis field. So first is, a fence around the property. The second is discretion, I think is really important with that access control. So the plot that cannabis is being grown in can't be visible from any public way. Typically that's done by the use of screening trees, both alongside the field itself and usually along the public way. A farmer that I work with uses sunflowers for those. He does 3 tiers of sunflowers, and that really gives a good blocking and good height to keep it off on the side without having to put in, big wooden fences to block the vision.
But it smells. So what do you do about that?
Well, let me finish and then I can jump over. So, the other thing is the monitoring. So the monitoring is typically done through the use of video cameras and the use of alarm systems. The Cannabis Commission requires the use of video access controls at the points of entry into the cannabis field, so you know who's coming in, who's coming out, at what time, and have a record of that. As you're saying, indoors, obviously there's a lot more you can work with because you have more points of structure to attach things to, and you're not concerned as much about the weather. So you have a few more options with where you can go. But for outdoor, it really can be done safely and effectively through the use of fencing and the use of security alarm monitoring. To work with the smell a little bit, one way that that's addressed is through setbacks, and essentially setting it back from a road, setting it inside of a different plant, and then using barrier screening plants such as those sunflowers to sort of help keep things a little bit more contained. If you plant a row of very fragrant honeysuckle or something along the edge of the farm, you'll be smelling that instead of the cannabis.
So is there a set of detailed logistical security measures for outdoor?
Yes, sir, in the regulations.
It's in the regulations. One thing that could be helpful is throughout sort of the negotiation process, if you will, before the regulations were finalized, the Cannabis Control Commission did agree that if you wanted to reduce anything in security, basically as long as the community was okay with that, you could take that to the commission and say, this is what we're proposing versus these regulations. They also have to show that to the local sheriff. I think ultimately it's the Cannabis Control Commission's decision on that. I would guess they're gonna defer to the municipality, because the municipality at the end of the day and the local sheriff, I would assume, knows how to, secure their local town or city. So, just something to keep in mind there.
I think with on the local, just as a personal thing, it's doing outdoor open cultivation. It's pretty much you're looking at more or less like a vandalism issue. It's looking at it as a vandalism issue in the beginning, because like I said, there's no psychoactive components until the last few weeks. So, but just treat it like anything else you would. I mean, like they say, locks keep people honest. So you put a fence up and just put a sign up that says, "Hey, this premise is being monitored." But honestly, it's not. It's really what would you feel comfortable with. And with something like this, I personally would want a perimeter fence and then an interior fence with some signs and maybe some motion detectors on the out. But it's how do you feel comfortable with this? And like I say, it's just controlled access.
Real quick, just to clarify, Bill is right in terms of the psycho component active with cultivation, but you don't get that effect unless you actually smoke it or combust it, basically.
Well, yeah,
So in other words,
or process in
Right.
some point. But so it's exactly it's so there's no it's like going into the vegetables. It's like an animal tearing up your vegetables before you produce the vegetables. Even if the tomatoes are this big and green, once the plant's broken, there's no good. So nobody's coming in when you're 2 weeks or 3 weeks into flower and gonna jack you out and come and take everything you have. It's actually that after time it's just right. And during those periods, I'm sure, just like anything, you're gonna have any other crop. It's gonna be a critical time, and you would probably increase your monitoring and your surveillance at that point when you say, hey, it's a critical point in time.
And I just have one follow-up question. What is the revenue incentive remuneration with this cash crop per acre? What is that? What is that figured at?
That's really hard to say, especially we don't have a lot of numbers in this area, because just for outdoor, for instance, it makes it harder because the way September comes in, then the cold wet rains will give you botrytis throughout your flowers. So that's why it's beneficial to use hoop houses or to use greenhouses. But there's also short-term flowers that you can use that can get it done a little bit quicker. But that being said, they use square footage as the canopy size, as the limits or
You do
the
your measurement,
parameters.
basically,
Yeah, and so outdoors you would trellis your plant. You would decide how big each plant is, and usually that's all depending on the strain. That's all depending on your soil type. It really could vary so much. And the fact is, we're going by square foot, not by acre. So to do an actual acre, it's not efficient. You have to break them into rows, like raised beds, and to cover them to be most efficient.
Do we have a ballpark on?
it's,
I mean,
What is it?
is it $5 a square foot, or is it $5,000 a square foot, is it
I would
$10,000 an acre?
if it's helpful.
I'm
I
just,
would
I'm
look.
just,
I've
I
seen-
would look at
I've
it.
seen-
information purposes.
and also it depends on this, there's so many different variables. You could be a complete failure. You could get hit with mold at the end, but it's, honestly, it's very, very lucrative, and I mean, there's a lot of different things. It'll be like whether you're going for flowers or just plant material that holds cannabinoids or psychoactive material. It's and that's also very dependent on the market, because there's really no real indicators where the market's going to be. So it's I wouldn't feel comfortable.
The reason I present that question is if you're gonna invest in $50,000 worth of security, this, that, and the other thing, extra patrols or whatever for outdoor or, you know, infield cultivation, what would you anticipate? I'm just throwing something.
You-
What would
honestly,
you anticipate, would you be gaining off of, hey, so you, say you get 35 acres, and I wanna put 3 acres into cannabis, as you indicated, like, hey, you can offset blah, 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 this, that, and the other thing. What could you anticipate to offset your payoff of the security, blah, 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 blah.
I'd say maybe it's. I think it would be hard to put a monetary value on it, but I guess maybe like an estimate, maybe like 100 pounds for a 100-foot greenhouse for a 3,500 square foot greenhouse total, but that would really have maybe 2,000 square foot of growing space. But that would be 100 pounds maybe would be like. If you were really, really good, you could do more. If you weren't that successful, you do less. If you had tragedy, it'd be none. But that being said, it's all up to the market.
Yeah, I'd really look at it as a price per pound, basically, and what is the market, getting essentially.
$300 an ounce.
Right. I mean, right now it's through the roof because we have
I was just
we're
throwing
going to
that
have
out
a
there
shortage for the.
from an economic standpoint,
Yeah.
from a agricultural standpoint, from a cultivation standpoint, from a regulation security standpoint, for open cultivation. That's the only reason I presented it.
And also, the quality of
Logistics standpoint.
the product. But I mean, I've heard in California they're saying $500 a pound. So is like what they're getting right now, and the commercial level is what they anticipate kind of. And I'm sure that'll increase over the next, for multiple reasons. Here it's a little bit higher because we have a lot less. There's a lot more goes into the project. We have less agricultural space in use for cultivation. Our medical program wasn't as successful in the number of patients and providers that California has. So that definitely has a big change, a lot to do with it. And once we get some hard numbers from even the first year, it's going to be a lot easier. And to tell this, we haven't grown on a commercial level out here, so we don't know that there's something that other people might be overlooking. We know mold and mildew are the number one killers for the crops right now, and that's why it's I would suggest not open cultivation unless you were using open flower, auto flowers, or very short-term strains that can be harvested early September.
Or have a fungicide program to counteract those issues.
Yeah, that's definitely. But you really, honestly, without some really harsh chemicals, you're gonna get hammered. And like so, there's a chemical that they use out in California for the grape industry. That's an antifungal that causes insane amounts of complications when it's burned or ingested. So you can't a lot of the time just renders the cannabis useless. And when they're cold and sit wet, when they're already in the plant stage, they'll rot from the inside out, and it's just keep them dry is the only way to prevent it.
Another thing towards the use of fungicides is by statute, you're only allowed to use biologically derived substances for your pest control and for your fungus management, everything of that nature. So just like Bill was saying, even if it's used in other places, even if it's used in other organic agriculture, it may not be allowed for use in cannabis, and you're incredibly limited as to what you can do for cannabis. It's really almost what can you do to passively control the growth of mold or fungus versus trying to address it after the fact.
Yeah, you can't apply Bravo or anything like that, or you can't.
Or fennel,
Well,
when you put anything into a confined area, such as if you're trying to grow a crop, and you start to pile that all into one particular area, you create a petri dish.
Oh, yeah.
Where it can run on you. So whether it's cannabis, whether it's Macintosh, whether it's corn.
Oh, it's tough in the Northeast. I'm sure if anybody here is familiar with home cultivators, there was a lot of people very upset last September when those storms rolled in. Eastern Mass, a lot of people there lost their entire crop just to botrytis before September was over.
This gentleman in the back, then we'll get that lady.
First, I'd like to thank the speakers. I found this to be very informative. Secondly, as a resident of Templeton, just curious if anyone up there has any information on what's the current state of things regarding cannabis in the town itself, if anything.
I'll defer that to Lori. She's the Development Services Director.
Pass that ball.
Yeah.
After speaking with the planning board, they are not looking to put in any current regulations that are going to prohibit anything. So at the moment, it's a case of if it fits in retail, it's retail. If it fits in whatever category it's zoned as currently, if it fits that category, it fits.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I should say, that's something that a lot of towns are really adopting. That's something that I personally am a huge fan of. That's saying, treat this like a business like any other. So we don't have separate retail for, gas stations versus gas stations with car wash versus gas stations with car wash that also sell cigarettes. They're all just handled under retail. And if you look at the nature of the business, there's already existing use codes and there's already existing mechanisms within town planning that can address these and can cite these effectively. Some towns are going to the other extreme and saying every cannabis business needs to be in this industrial park that's been at half capacity for 50 years and is hard to access. But how many times do you guys say, oh, gee, I really need to go make a retail purchase. Let me go drive to the other side of town to some industrial park and go dodge dump trucks as I'm trying to park. They should be zoned with like business type. So maybe a transporter is out in that business park. Maybe an indoor cultivator is out in that business park. But the retailer, he'd fit great in the shopping district. And the research facility, maybe they fit in a technology development. And looking at it in that fashion as saying, what is the core of this business versus what is the product type and how can we zone it effectively is, I think, an incredibly progressive way to view things. And I think is really the way communities in the Commonwealth should be addressing the topic. So thank you.
And then we'll go from left to right. So.
I'm Beverly Bartholomew. I've lived in Templeton all my life. I'm an old lady. I went to Hawaii for a month this winter, and I went to a 3-day cannabis, I forget what do you call it?
Retreat or something?
No, it was an
Conference?
open house.
Conference? Like a master
Conference.
class, yeah.
It was a conference.
Very cool.
And they had all kinds of booths, like you were talking about, people sell different things, people made shakes with it. There was anything and everything, the people that sold supplies were there. And then they had classes. Well, I sat in a classroom like this and I looked around me and I said, holy smokes. There were all kinds of people, middle-aged and up. There were no kids there. What you find in this area, I think, is fear. And it's fear of something they've heard horrendous things about. I have fibromyalgia. I have chronic fatigue. I still work with my husband. He's a farmer. I can tell you one thing. Trying to plant the stuff outside is gonna be difficult because you can't control the sunlight.
Yep.
Okay? And he is right about botrytis. We grow vegetable plants. When I was a kid, you could put something in the ground, you didn't have to do anything to it. Not today. Bad stuff comes in on the rain. We had the best tomato crop ever when we put it under the hoop house. So, I go to a pain doctor, because now everybody's deciding they're gonna croak, taking pain pills, so I gotta go to a pain doctor. I never took more medication than I was supposed to. I never felt the need to. I guess I don't have an addictive personality. I'm lucky. But I go to this guy and he gives me a rash of crap. Then you try to get them to give you a prescription, and they screw that up, so you run back and forth, back and forth. It costs $30 to go to the pain doctor every other month. And I says to him, what if I try medical marijuana? Come out of the chair about this goddamn high. It's not federally approved. So I go to this girl that I have for a doctor, she's a nurse practitioner. I says to her, what am I gonna do? She said, well, can't you try it? I'm like, no, I can't try it because I get my urine tested. Well, to make a long story short, they sent me to Hawaii with a prescription nobody would fill in California or Hawaii. My husband ordered me some CBD oil. And I took myself off my pain medicine. And it wasn't easy, but I was so bound and determined that I wasn't gonna put up with this guy anymore. And now I feel so much better, I have an appetite. I use CBD oil with THC a little bit because it helps with my chronic fatigue. I do that in the morning, and CBD the rest of the time. I use lotion on my back. There, I have friends whose, one girl, her father had a stroke, he's having terrible pains in his legs. And it's overcoming the bad idea that people have about it. So I tell people, and sometimes people that are older, like me, look at me like, and it's like, no, it's not the bad thing that you pictured all those years. You know, and there are more, and they're not getting the bunny back in the bag. I'm gonna tell you that right now.
Do you guys want to jump in?
I would say, if you're available, I would love to take you to every town meeting I go to from here on out in the future. Because,
To not be afraid, and that there are opportunities for people that make edibles or sell the lighting, or just like you said, we have no industry in this town. We're gonna depend on the meals tax to buy us equipment. Good luck with that one. So 3% of anything is better than nothing.
Thank you very much, and I think it's success stories like that that
I'm
keep.
scared because once I come off those pain pills, it ain't gonna put me back on.
Well,
So
one
it's
of
a
the
leap of faith.
One of the fascinating things we've seen is in states that legalize cannabis, the rate of opiate prescription and the rates of opiate overdoses go down by orders and orders of magnitude. Exactly for that reason. You not only are supplementing and replacing, but 75% of opiate addicts start with a prescription. And if you can break that cycle before it ever begins by saying, instead of taking 10 Percocets and then seeing maybe next time you come back and get 20 and 30 and so on, and then it becomes the horror story that we're all familiar with, saying, try medical cannabis and try using it as a supplement and replacement, you prevent that
It's not
75% ever
painful,
coming.
but you're so much better off. And you're not subjected to somebody that's giving you a rash because they can.
Well, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story, and I can't thank you enough for your viewpoint, so thank you. It reinforces what I'm doing.
Steve, do you have a question?
We have several.
Here we go. The lawyer's up speaking now.
I want to speak to the lawyer. You are a lawyer, right?
Yes, sir.
I'm proud of that. Anyway, I was hoping that the CCC was gonna come here, and I do appreciate too, as he said, that you came. And I think talking about cannabis is a great thing. I've been doing it for 25 years, maybe more. The fact of the matter is that you had mentioned about craft cooperatives. Do you happen to know how many licenses there are specifically to the cooperative aspect? I have another question too.
Well,
Is
can
it
we
okay
address
to
them one by
bombard you?
one, or are we doing these all?
Well, you know, the most
One
important
list.
part is the independent testing labs that has been frequently in the paper, and that's stopping all of the, adult use, and not so much the adult use, but the being able to sell to adults openly in the commercial aspect.
I think that's medical.
The independent testing labs, there isn't, I wanna know how many licenses there are out there on just the labs, cause you can't sell anything unless it's been tested.
So there's, I believe, 2 labs currently operating in the Commonwealth. 4 labs, thank you, Blake. 4 labs currently operating within the Commonwealth. They work with medical patients, and they'll be testing to the same standard for recreational marijuana. So I have to confess, I'm not exactly sure of the connection between the rollout of the adult industry, which is going through its licensing and permitting phases, but in any capacity wouldn't be allowed to operate until July 1st. I don't know how the independent testing labs are holding that back. What I can say towards limitations, as we were discussing a little bit, or how many licenses are out there, there's no statewide cap on licenses, and there's no overall cap on the amount of licenses. It's not saying there will only be 20 testing labs and we hope that you get one of them. What they're instead saying is some license categories, you're restricted to operating only one of those facilities, and that can be the only one you operate. The micro license is like that, the independent testing lab is like that, the transporter is like that, and I believe the craft cooperative is like that. In others, you can have 3 separate licenses or 3 facilities, so 3 retail stores, 3 cultivation sites, 3 manufacturing sites under one entity, but you can only have those 3. And there's ways to control that based off the ownership and control of those entities, so it's not, I have James's Cannabis 1, James's Cannabis 2, James's Cannabis 3, and they all have 3 licenses. No, those are all tied to me, and I only get 3. So that's really where a limitation comes in. The other spot where a limitation comes in is on the municipal side. Municipalities can choose to restrict the amount of retailers within their site or within their jurisdiction to 20% of the amount of off-site package stores within their jurisdiction. If it comes to a fractional number, you round that number up. But as for the other license types, anything that's non-retail, there is no restriction on that, and it's essentially as many as the municipality sees fit to license.
Could you express too, the cost of those licenses?
So the licenses vary in cost depending on size. They're between $150 and $500 in application fees, and then up to, I believe, about $5,000 in annual renewals.
Are we
the
speaking
top of
to
my
the
head.
cultivation, or are we
Yeah,
speaking to?
it's all within the statute. They have a table within the
Right.
statute that lays it all
The
out very
table's
clearly and very
really
plainly.
all you need. It's very helpful.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah.
And real quick, craft marijuana cultivator cooperative, the way to look at that is you can have multiple cultivators under the cooperative, as many as you want, and up to 3 manufacturing facilities. The only thing is the cultivation is capped at 100,000 square foot of canopy space.
Now, my other question is on the medical marijuana side, the fact that all the grows, you had made mention that there wasn't a very profitable business due to the patients.
Sir, I'd have to ask when that came up.
Well, I heard it, and I've looked at it, and the amount of marijuana grows and selling facilities for medical, okay? They're limited to the medical patients, okay? And my point is I couldn't find, to substantiate what I heard there, I couldn't find any, really, I mean, online they say about the sales, how many pounds, how many ounces, but it doesn't really come to with particular, establishments. And under the circumstances and the amount of patients licensed converted to these people that have to pay out, like you said, was it $250,000 to be a cultivator?
Well, it's
I didn't think it was very
$250,000 to be a
profitable.
vertically
So
integrated medical facility if you're
question-
applying for 3.
Yeah, my question leads to, are they gonna, crap on the medical and go with the CCC and do away with, do you have any rumors of
So
that?
if you don't mind, just allow me to restate the question and see if I understand it correctly. So I think what you're saying is, will the recreational marketplace supplant the medical marketplace and drive them out of business? Is
Well, I don't
that-
mean drive them out, but I just think I think it'll be more applicable because there'll be more of them because of the license cost. And I think the fact of the matter is it's already been said that they were supposed to have some medical on hand for medical patients and so forth.
So yeah, so
Yeah.
let me
I'm
jump
asking,
in.
since you've been in Boston, so forth, are they gonna get rid of, medical? It makes no sense to have medical anymore.
Yeah, it does.
But aside from philosophical points aside, and I'll let you guys get into that, on a business side, which I'm more comfortable speaking about, existing medical facilities have the ability to be the first ones to convert over to recreational. They have a priority licensure, so that's one incentive to continued operation of a medical facility. You don't have to reapply to start a new facility, you can roll your existing one over. Now, those existing ones that roll over will have to maintain either 35% or, looking back to the past 6 months, maintain that supply for their medical patients going forward to ensure that there is a continuing medical supply. There's also a continuing incentive to be a medical patient, in addition to actually realizing some fantastic benefits, as you know, this woman was kind enough to share with all of us, from the use of medical cannabis. Medical cannabis is untaxed. So recreational cannabis is taxed at 20%, medical cannabis is untaxed. So people who want to have the ability to consume medical cannabis will have the ability to do so at a lower price point. In addition, medical cannabis patients are allowed to possess a higher amount of the product at any one time than a recreational user is, 10 ounces versus 1 ounce. Correlating to that, medical patients can also have higher potency edibles than recreational patients will be allowed. Recreational patients are limited to 5 milligram edibles, I believe 20 per pack, for a total of 100 milligrams of psychoactive material within any 1 unit of edibles. Medical edibles are unrestricted because some people really do need that very high concentrated dose. So what I would say to that is, you know, in any business, there are multiple sectors and multiple tiers of that business. I don't think just because one succeeds, it necessarily means the other one needs to fail or shouldn't exist. There's plenty of space for everybody to coexist. There's multiple tiers that people can enter into the marketplace at, and there's different demands from the consumers themselves. So I see the medical program not only continuing, I see it thriving in the future.
They get bigger, people stop being afraid.
Do you guys want to jump in?
You know, I think James very eloquently stated that, and it's correct. There's lots of benefits. Plus, they also do have. If you're a medical patient, you can receive home delivery at this point. There are a lot of benefits, but I think a lot of people, as well as if I remember correctly, that Mass Health does provide a stipend if you do have a medical state verified medical card.
Oh, so that's the other thing. The medical program has a hardship program where if you can prove certain factors, that you're on Mass Health, that you receive SSDI, I believe that you're within 300% of the federal poverty level for your family size. I'm almost positive those are the 3 factors. I used to practice bankruptcy law, so I might be confusing them with the petition waiver fees for bankruptcy law, so don't hold me to that. You know, there's really a lot that's being done to give outreach to the medical patients, to support the medical patients, and I think something we really need to recognize up here as a panel and also as a group, none of us would be here if it wasn't for the advocacy and if it wasn't for the work that the medical patients have done. The Mass Patients Advocacy Alliance is really a leader in that field, and they have timelessly and continually gone to the barricades for medical patients and to progress the ability of medical patients to move forward. You know, there's plenty other groups out there that work like MPAA and do things to support medical patients. And I'll say it over and over again, none of us would be here and none of us would be discussing recreational marijuana if it wasn't for the success and the strength of the medical program to say this can be done effectively, this can be done responsibly, and this can be done in a community-forward fashion. So I think we owe them all a debt of gratitude.
Just really quick, did I hear at the very beginning of this that the only zoned area you can grow in currently is industrial and commercial zones? Is that? Or did I
I think that varies town to town.
Yeah.
It's individual town bylaws and zoning
And if there
restrictions.
isn't anything that says one or the
Then
other?
be proactive with your town and be heard and try to advocate for practical location of potential cultivation or any type of cannabis business.
Okay, I guess because at the beginning when I heard, you know, that it wasn't considered agriculture, that's why I was
A
thinking.
lot of people copy and pasted the medical program and literally put it in,
Yeah,
like,
it's
just
kinda
were like, oh, that's easy, we'll just put that in, and that wasn't taking a lot of things into consideration. And like James said, with the success of that, they were able to show that it's, you know, maybe at this point, maybe just you can handle it like plutonium, and maybe at a later date might be some other radioactive materials.
So to tie a few things together, I think because of the fear that's existed in the past in this industry, it's forced people like Lori to say, as a planning officer, we need to take this scary item and put it in the least desirable part of town, which usually is industrial zoning. If it's not fit for any other purpose, let's put a factory there type of thing. So traditionally in the past, a lot of these have been located in industrial zones because they're the least amount of objection. While a residential homeowner might have an issue with a site coming in next to them, fulfillment depot typically isn't going to say anything as long as their trucks aren't impeded with. By no means is it restricted to industrial land. I think we have to do exactly what Lori said and look to the use type, look to the underlying core concept of the business, and then see how that fits into the existing zoning structures as we would for any other type of business. We couldn't open up a car wash in our front yard, but it might be perfect for the highway business district, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
This lady in the back, and then we'll get this gentleman.
So Eric, given the delays in licensing that we're all having our patients tested with right now, when would you guess we will see the first craft cooperative legally drop seeds?
Oh, boy.
Throw 'em right under the fire.
I won't mention their name. I know of a group in Truro that I believe has officially applied. We have not yet. We're working in several different municipalities, so as you can imagine, getting over the hump in one municipality, let alone several municipalities, is a big feat. I think I picked the toughest licensing structure to achieve strategically. So, but I think honestly, I know I'm really biased, but I think honestly the craft marijuana cultivator cooperative model is something that honestly can go nationwide. As far as I really think it benefits the cultivator. I think it's a cultivator first type of model. That will be not only successful here but across the country. As far as seeds in the ground, I don't want to make predictions. We're hopeful that certainly by the end of 2018 we'll be cultivating. We're hoping for first harvest maybe in fall time, but I don't want to jinx us basically. So, but the folks in Cape Cod I think are a little further ahead.
This gentleman, then we'll.
So I'm a former municipal attorney, so I can just give a little background on why agricultural definition was swept out from under cannabis. There's a statute, MGL Chapter 48, Section 3, which basically says any land 5 acres or greater, the people who have that land have the unfettered right to farm on it. So the state legislature said, if we don't close this loophole, everyone with more than 5 acres is gonna grow fields and fields of cannabis.
Right.
So that was a backdoor way. Obviously, everyone intellectually knows when you put a seed in the ground and a plant comes up, that's agriculture. But, that's some legalistic jujitsu to make it harder to do what you want. So that's just the backstory on that. I have a question, sort of a farm nerd question. So you were mentioning how hemp pulls heavy metals out from the soil. Is there a strategic crop rotation like you do with some other, foodstuffs with nitrogen fixing, et cetera, or is it...
I think those are some things that have been worked on a lot. Like I said, the Northeast Grain Growers Association up in Vermont, they've been doing lots of hemp trials, and they've kind of been doing some companion planting or some rotations, and they're finding out that it does clean up a lot of stuff. Like you could rotate it over tobacco and then still be able to grow other stuff through. But I think that's some things that are kind of being put in the studies. It's definitely more of a for the hemp. I know in Colorado they're doing extensive amounts of hemp, and I'm sure they're doing lots of keeping their data and processing it, and also how do you make your crop more successful is rotational grazing usually helps. I know it does break down the hard pan pretty well. It sequesters soil really well, and it also brings out all these other materials, and especially the stubble is pretty much very useful as well.
We'll get Steve.
Yeah, I'd like to elaborate on that. Like I said, when I was watching Lewis the night that we all voted, and when he passed that, the devastating legislation and taking out the farms aspect of the vote. The point though was, what people have to understand is what I first said. The cannabis hemp is, cannabis 3% is considered hemp, and you can't get stoned on it. They grow it for all the different purposes, for stocks and clothes and oils and all the rest of it. And that's where you get your best CBD in some cases. And my point is that, there's a lot of fear mongering that went on in that, and the farmers did get it taken out of it. And Ann Golby tried to bring this forth, and again, there's a pending bill that I put in that actually reverses all of that. It's called 1062. 1062 is still stuck in committee, and it basically reverts that back to where it was first put in. And so I would ask you guys, since you're doing this, is to, support the bill. I've been on Golby's hit list, so she won't do it. So it's political.
Well, what I'd like to just quickly say generally is, we wouldn't be here where we're standing without the medical patients who all have been great activists for this. So, as the phrase goes, be the change you want to see in your community. If you do have an idea about this, if you do have a way that you think the industry or the product or anything could be improved, I would encourage you to reach out to whoever you think would be the greatest stakeholder in that, whether it's the operator themselves, whether it's the municipality, whether it's a state leader. Let your voice be heard on the subject. We're a small commonwealth, and we have a responsive town government, we have a responsive state government, and I think that's something we should be proud of.
Bob, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to thank the two gentlemen for coming tonight. It's been very good. And thank Eric and Lloyd for putting this on. Yeah, I just, simply you guys are doing really good at just, giving out information here. So I'm just looking for more information from Eric on how a cultivator would become a part of a cooperative. Basically, the process, the stipulations and regulations on the cultivator individually, not on the cooperative as a whole, but on, just the grower. Because I'm sure in a lot of cases, that's what a lot of people will end up being. They don't want to be let's say, they don't want to be doing the testing, they don't want to be responsible for the, number 1394, number 1394, and all this. They don't want the paperwork aspect of it because they're farmers.
Right.
They want to till the soil, they don't want to do the paperwork. So could you speak to that a little bit?
I mean, I would just say what you just said is the business model of Farm Bug Cooperative, basically. So I do have a fellow co-founder, Adam Goodless, and he is our operations person. I'm on the advocacy and farming side. So you could probably drill down to Adam as far as supply chain, numbers, all that. He can geek out all day when it comes to that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's really what you described. It's a cultivator cooperative, and Adam and I working on the business side to bring those cultivators to marketplace. For me, I'm a marketer. The first thing you do as a marketer, you learn your product. So what did I do? I was like, okay, I need to learn how to grow immediately, and I need to learn how to talk to growers and farmers immediately. So, the big thing in marketing now is content marketing. You really need to know both your product and your customers, basically, at the end of the day. So from my standpoint, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I mean, I'm also an activist as well. I really try to sort of inject that a little bit into our organization. But from a standpoint of, entering the cooperative, I think there's a couple things I can speak to. One, we are capped at the 100,000 square foot, so that's just something to be aware of as far as the canopy space. What we talk about in our cooperative now is having a cultivating member and what we're calling a contributing member. The idea of the contributing member is that you're contributing to the cooperative. We're perhaps bringing you on to become a cultivating voting member, but perhaps you're not there yet, be it you're not zoned yet, let's say, at the local level, whatever it may be. So that's kind of maybe the way to look at the cooperative structure. We're also going to be, coming together a group, voting on bylaws. We're working on our bylaws now. Part of the organization obviously is having, set meetings, be them quarterly or yearly. It's a democratic organization, so all the cultivators in the organization will have voting rights. And also, you know, we're dead set on any sort of financing that comes into the cooperative. We're definitely going to need financing for sure. Those financiers aren't going to have any sort of voting rights. The cultivators will have voting rights, and there'll likely be a board of directors of sorts. We're still kind of working that out because, you know, we're kind of in the process of coming together. The idea to be on the board of directors is you don't want the cultivators to be gridlocked, and a board of directors with voting rights can maybe steer on you know, certain things that people are voting on. But yeah, it's a completely democratic organization. Again, look up the 7 principles of a cooperative. It's supposed to be completely autonomous of the government and any other corporation. You know, that's the idea behind a cooperative. And yeah, I mean, just to end, what you said was perfectly kind of our concept for what it is. Essentially, we want the cultivators at the end of the day to do what they're good at, so that they don't have to be doing the quote unquote paperwork.
If I might just follow up this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With that, God, I said I'd follow up and I just.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it goes, it happens, it happens.
I guess to simplify, I'm a potential or hoping farmer for co-op, for Farm Bug Co-op, and pretty much it's you know, you try to on your own. There's a few things you can do on your own. There's pretty much acquire your land and try to get some knowledge and stuff. But more or less, you know, for the farmer, the Farm Bug will help bring the product to market, give you options for different types of packaging. They're going to be co-branded, so people will recognize that these come from the co-op. The co-op itself will have internal quality control. We'll have cultivators that were able to come out and consult and help people, especially the people in the beginning. We'll be doing soil tests, sap tests, tissue samples. We're going to be going through it all just to make sure that we're producing the best product. But as far as that, it's you can call Eric, send an email into the Farm Bug to become a member of the newsletter, and then extend the point that you want to say, hey, I want to cultivate, I want to know more. And honestly, it's the easiest and smartest way to do it for somebody who wants to concentrate all their efforts into growing.
And self-policing, just real quick, is an interesting aspect of a cooperative. If you know, I think it's Jerry's Eggs, if I'm not mistaken, sell the Whole Foods.
Pete
I don't know
and Jerry's.
if they're Pete and Jerry's Eggs. I don't know if they're officially a cooperative, but you know, the idea behind them is they have very high standards for their poultry. Keepers, and to even get into Jerry's Eggs, you have to make sure you sort of meet their standards. So, you know, we definitely want to, as a group, adhere to very, high cultivation standards. Basically, that's certainly the idea as well.
And I would say just real quickly, for people who are looking to enter the industry, if I can give a quick plug for my own organization, my Mass Cannabis Business Association. We really look to be a big tent organization, have both entity members and individual members, where people could join. There are no dues for calendar year 2018, so it's easy to join, and it's all online. And we provide networking events. We provide the opportunity for people to interact and make those connections. So if you came to one of my events and said, I'd want to start a cooperative, I would say, absolutely go talk to Eric. If you said, I want to start a transportation facility, I'd refer you to someone else. And, you know, not only people who are looking to enter the industry, there's also members who have the businesses and are looking for employees, looking for partners, looking for investors. So I would encourage everyone here, take a look at it. It's masscba.com, the Mass Cannabis Business Association. We'd love to have everyone in this room as a member. And what we really do is try to provide opportunities like this, panel discussions, networking events. It's a broad-based, pro-growth, nonpartisan entity that I think could really do a lot to help sort of make those connections within the industry.
We'll take one more question and then we'll.
This is actually just a statement. There's an organization, not to trample on his plug, but there's an organization called the Massachusetts Grower Advocacy Council, and I don't know offhand if they have a finger on the pulse of who's doing co-ops, but all they do is have networking events for growers. So
yeah,
I think they'll
Peter
figure it
Bernard
out.
has that.
Yeah.
It's another advocacy council for cultivators.
This lady had one more question, then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, I was just,
I
a
like that.
question about the, visually, does an industrial hemp plant look like a cannabis plant? If they're growing, can you tell the difference?
Taller.
right?
It's
So-
tall, yeah, but they're very,
Tall, thin.
yeah, it's the way they're grown, definitely, they're grown like corn almost, where they're planted in rows, many seeds. If you're cultivating for cannabis for the flowers, you're definitely gonna want it to branch out more and have individual attention.
I
But
had
speaking
sort of
to,
heard, like in the back door of USDA, that one of the reasons why they were reluctant to allow industrial hemp to be a federally legal crop to use federal funds for, was because of the inspection of maybe inspectors wouldn't be able to tell the difference.
Well, luckily with MDR, they can take, when you have the hemp license, you have to allow them onto your property as a condition of having the license, as it would be for indoor grower, where they can come through and they can take clippings and they can take samples, bring them to one of those 4 labs. The turnaround time from those labs is absolutely fantastic. It's less than a week for most of them, knock on wood. But, the turnaround time is absolutely fantastic, and it really gives the ability to show this is a non-psychoactive product. It hasn't been cross-pollinated by any measure. I think really and Eric can speak to this in detail, there's a phenomenal incentive to keep hemp products and marijuana products geographically separated, because you don't want your hemp products coming up over that 0.3%, and you don't want your marijuana products dropping down. So, sort of the side by side, is this one hemp, is that one cannabis? You're gonna have 2 poor products versus 2 outstanding ones if you give them a little bit of geographic separation.
Thank you.
May I ask a question, please?
Sure, we'll take one last question, then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you. My question is again on the federal aspects, okay? Because you had mentioned that, and a lot of people that are considering doing this and everything, and people who don't know anything about it, like you to explain the fact that the feds have to arrest their own people. And then, in other words, there's no prosecution unless it's in federal court if you're on a federal house. If you're you have to be on an enclave, federal enclave. You have to go to a federal court, all right? And they have to be the ones that prosecute. So the situation is that the state law, all right, under the state law currently, and I'm asking you if you agree with it, the fact that, none of the authorities can do very much about any of this on federal terms. The federal law can only be enforced by federal authorities. Isn't that right?
I would disagree. Federal law is the law of the land, so it covers all of the land. You don't, while there are different jurisdictions, you don't get to claim sanctuary by jumping over the door of the post office and saying, well, now I'm on federal land, so the state cops can't touch me, and vice versa. So, I would disagree with that point. I don't really, to be honest, I don't see the connection of it can only be done by a federal officer in a federal enclave, which I'm not quite sure of the definition of that term. What I would say is there is a disconnect between federal policy and state level policy. It is still a, Schedule I substance. We are no longer protected by the Cole Memorandum. The Cole Memorandum was pre-existing legislation that essentially said if you follow these 19 points of conscientious operation and good business, prevent diversion, prevent trafficking, have high degrees of scrutiny and oversight, have a well-run state licensure program, everything Massachusetts is doing and doing above and beyond. It essentially said the Justice Department will not be allowed to use any governmental funds to prosecute operators who meet all of the 19 conditions of the Cole Memorandum. When we had our budget crisis back last October, everything got defunded, and with that, the Cole Memorandum went out the window. The spirit of the Cole Memorandum is looking to be revived in what's known as the States Act, which was recently put forward by Elizabeth Warren and Cory Gardner, which essentially would take a lot of those Cole Memorandum protections and enshrine them into actual positive law. That's something I really hope to see happen. It's something that's received a lot of good bipartisan support so far. It's received some favorable attention from the White House, so it looks like, this is really a bill that does have some good legs to it and something that I really personally would support. Anything that sort of normalizes that policy and makes things more predictable, as I'm sure Blake, as you as a municipal attorney will say, we crave predictability. And if you know what it is moving forward and you know how to reliably inform your clients, then you're serving them best as an attorney. It's hard to do so when you say, maybe this, maybe that. Much better to be able to give a positive answer. So I really look forward to a decision on the States Act. That disconnect is something we have to deal with. It's something that we have to be aware of and deal with every day. We've had legal marijuana here in Massachusetts for the better part of a year now. We haven't had the DOJ kicking in the door of anyone's dispensary again, knock on wood. And I think that's due to the caliber of operators that are in Massachusetts, the responsibility they operate with, and the fact that Massachusetts regulators can really stand behind their program with a great amount of pride and say, this is something fantastic we've set up. I'll sleep a lot easier when I know that that will never be a possibility. But for right now, it's something that I think, quite frankly, people need to be aware of. And as we were saying earlier, use your voice, use your propensity for activism. If this is something that you would like to see changed, reach out to Elizabeth Warren, reach out to whoever your local representative is. Tell them that you support actions like this, and tell them that you'd like to see that policy normalized. It sounds cliche, but that really is the way to affect change. Calling, writing letters, getting FaceTime with leaders, and letting them know your viewpoints. And in my experience, as you can see from Eric, leaders in the municipal community are incredibly receptive to hearing the opinion, when it's presented effectively and when it's presented, in a fashion that really looks to help out all sides of the issue.
Eric, Bill, did you have any other comments, closing thoughts?
Sorry, do you want to go about it?
No, not really. Geez, I think we covered all the bases, and like I said before, it's try to be proactive. Reach out and find out your local bylaws before they get changed without your voice.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I guess to piggyback off what James was saying, for me, this all started as activism. I went to the Joint Committee on Marijuana Policy a little over a year ago, back in April, was that 16, 17, I don't know at this point. I was scared to death. I was by myself, didn't have any friends. I testified in front of the Joint Committee, the packed house, because obviously it was like, a pretty popular subject, and yeah, delivered it. I was in support of cooperatives, and it kind of just snowballed from there. I developed a good relationship with my state senator, and Patricia Gillen, who actually was sit on the Joint Committee for Marijuana Policy and was the co-chair, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And so developed a relationship with her office, and really just, snowballed from there. Ironically, or I shouldn't say ironically, believe it or not, you can change the government through activism and through advocacy, like James said. So, so I would just encourage, like everyone's saying here, encourage everyone to get active and make sure that, the industry is the industry that we all want it to be, basically, at the end of the day.
Thank you guys for your time. Let's give our panelists a hand.
Yeah,